Hello, we have here Professor Arjun Appadurai. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm very happy to have you here because you're one of the great thinkers of our time and a source of inspiration also in some ways to the project of Book City. Arjun Appadurai is first of all an anthropologist. This means that he can look at our world, at our society from very different points of view, very different perspectives. And with these tools, he has been exploring globalization in his works, and he explained us that in spite of globalization, of what lots of scholars say about globalization, the world is not a single system, but it's an intersection of different landscapes. So it's a complex world, and we do not have easy and simple solutions for the problem we have to confront with. Another area of interest of Professor Appadurai is things. This is the last book that has been appearing in these days in Italy, published by Meltemi, The Social Life of Things, la vita sociale delle cose. And we will talk about this later. It's a very interesting book because it uses anthropology, of course, but also history and economy to understand the way goods are being traded. And it's not just a problem of money, of value, but it's also a cultural and political problem. Another thing that Professor Appadurai has been saying us is that we have the right and the responsibility to imagine a different world and to craft it. We need a more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive planet. We know that science, big corporation, states work to build a world at their own image, but it's a kind of different from the world that we imagine, that we dream, with our hopes, with our imagination, with our aspirations, and with the idea we have of a good life. So what the Professor Appadurai says is that we have to work on these ideas, on these hopes, to craft the world we want to live in. And in this process, culture has a very important role. I will just mention the title of one of his last books, The Future as a Cultural Fact, so you will understand what culture means for Professor Appadurai. So we are very curious to listen to your ideas of what will happen after these 2 terrible years, after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, to the Book City organization as a whole, and to uh, Meltemi, which has honored me by translating several of my works into Italian, so I can feel that I have at least some readers in Italy. Uh, since I'm now living in Berlin, I feel even more uh, aware of what is going on in Italy in different ways. But of course, it's a country with a very distinguished history, also a distinguished history of authors, ideas, and books. And I'm thinking in my own life of the importance of Gramsci and of Lampedusa and of Ignazio Silone, people who are now not often talked about so much. Gramsci, yes, but Lampedusa and Silone and others, maybe a little less so. So Italy for me is full of interesting traditions, including the traditions of new trends in Marxist studies. I think some of the most interesting trends in the world, which include people like the work of people like Antonio Negri, have everything to do with Italy. So we are many of us appreciate Italian intellectual life and literary life and scholarly life in numerous ways. That said, I'm going to just speak briefly, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, give or take, in the hope that I can say more in the dialogue with you and perhaps with anyone else. And I'm going to talk about the future. And I want to, of course, I have in my mind that because of the pandemic, we are all not only somewhat imprisoned in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, in our own cities, in our own countries, but we are also imprisoned in a way in the present. Uh, the present will not let us be free. It does not let us enjoy planning and hoping and wishing and desiring because uh, the regulations that dominate us are so much about today, next week, next month. So I know personally when I try to think of what will I do in the spring, what will I do in 2022, I have to keep saying, well, that depends on the pandemic. So my future is already somewhat under pressure. So I have this in the back of my mind, but I also think it's very important at the moment to insist that we can think above and beyond the pandemic, that we should not look at all the concerns in our lives through the lens of the pandemic, though we can, of course, not forget the pandemic. So, in that spirit, I'm going to just make a few general comments as you asked me to about the future as I see it in light of my earlier work, but also recently. So, let me begin by saying that interest in the future has accelerated in the last few years across a range of the social sciences and the humanities. In anthropology, once devoted to the study of custom, habit, and memory, the future has become a major focus. Designers are bringing the future ever more into their own discussions and inventions surrounding gaming, applications, and personal devices. In the humanities, too, the making and unmaking of futurity has become highly visible. For example, the theme of the 2018 annual conference of the Association for African Studies in the USA concerns African futures, which is also a major theme in public discussions of the remarkably successful recent film Black Panther. Likewise, in fields as diverse as economics, game design, energy technology, educational psychology, and others, there is an explosion of degrees, programs, and certificates in one or other aspects of future studies. Futures and futurity are growing at a striking rate. And of course, there are those for whom scenario building, extrapolation, forecasting, and prediction have always been vital to their interests. Climatologists, urban planners, demographers, energy scientists, and others. And in various other fields like sociology and finance studies, the future has become really a very important subject of investigation. And indirect evidence of the plenitude of futures is to be found in this academic explosion. So it is worth asking why this explosion of interest in the future has occurred. And I think that one possible cause for this renewed interest in futurity, especially in the social sciences, uh, comes from the new digital platforms, tools, and affordance technologies, which have speeded up the experience of obsolescence and upgrading, and have thus created a new relationship between risk, innovation, failure, and futurity. I also think that this new relationship appears to expand possible futures, but the reality, and this is my main point, is that it threatens to shrink them. In other words, the future appears to be expanding, but actually it's shrinking due to our new technologies. So, what I want to understand, and I can only touch on this briefly today, is this paradoxical relationship between scarcity and plenitude in our emerging futures. And for this, I also want to touch on how failure has emerged as a slogan of entrepreneurial cultures in the digital era. So, doubtless, you have heard the positive use of the term failure, like fail often, fail forward, etc., meaning failure is a good thing. So, the paradox here is that while entrepreneurial disruptions in the digital era seem to profit from the virtues of new modes of sociality, their apparent popularity and success, they actually rely on the failure of prior modes of sociality. Thus, the entrepreneurial multiplication of social apps enables the shrinkage of futures anchored in non digital socialities. This is the dark side of the creative destruction. This is the phrase of Joseph Schumpeter, which he identified as the primary dynamic force of industrial capitalism, creative destruction. And this process, in my view, the kind of emphasis on creative destruction and on constant failure of old technologies to be replaced by new technologies, uh, signals a new chapter in the commodification of sociality, whose earlier histories can be found in advertising and its related modes of mass consumption. So, what I'm saying is the new digitality uh, is a kind of innovative chapter in the commodification of sociality itself. So let me say just now, in my remaining time, a little bit about scarce futures, why the future is becoming scarce. So we live in an age in which the future seems infinitely expandable. As I have said, we have new tools for planning, forecasting, and predicting. We also have new vehicles for precaution, insurance, and hedging. The future seems infinitely and ubiquitously available, largely by means of digital devices and convenience. Indeed, the future appears to have become a giant convenience available to us in the form of an expanding universe of apps. Yet, this plenitude of futures, in my view, is an illusion which masks a growing scarcity of futures. So, why do I feel this or think this? Firstly, the spread and growth of digital affordances through handheld devices, especially the iPhone or the mobile phone, is crowding out a huge diversity of social and cultural futures which have marked the world in the past. As I and others have argued, the ways in which anticipation, aspiration, and imagination have combined and crystallized is as varied as the forms of culture themselves. Since these formations all turn on some image of the good life, it does not take a very deep analysis to see that the diversity of the world's cultural traditions is also expressed in images of such basic values as health, wealth, and wisdom, which in turn generate more fine grained values about well being, equality, justice, and knowledge. So, Buddhists do not see the same wealth in the same way as Protestants, and Islam does not see uh, progress in the same terms as Christianity. And this list of differences in our basic values is can go on. The desirable future, the desirable future, uh, which then leads to all efforts to prognosticate or predict and plan, is as variable as language and culture themselves. In other words, what people want in the future is a highly variable thing. This enormous variety is what is under pressure from the new world of digital conveniences, which brings speed, personal convenience, and price to the front in how people are encouraged to envisage the life possibilities available to them. The digital revolution, especially in the ways it links failure, obsolescence, innovation, and convenience, is making deep inroads into this hitherto wide range of culturally defined visions of the future, and it therefore contributes directly to the shrinking of the future on a global basis. Nor is this shrinkage just a matter of cultural diversity. It is a deeply political issue, for the breadth and variety of cultural images of the good life, and thus of the future, is also the condition of possibility for political criticism, debate, and mobilization. As images of what is possible, convenient, and available shrink, so do images of what is fair, just, and morally acceptable. The digitalization of the future, which the new world of app based innovation ushers in, brings the question of possible and desirable futures into the realm of the cheap, the fast, and the convenient. This is not the best environment in which to imagine political alternatives to our current world of violence, immiseration, disease, and displacement. Now, it may be objected to what I'm saying that the new digital world also opens up new modes of imaging, representation, communication, and mobilization, which were previously unavailable and are prima facie progressive. The Arab Spring, for example, the new forms of climate activism, recent efforts to resist finance capital, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement, even new utopian imagining, such as can be seen in the Afrofuturism of various films and art performances, are clearly enriched, even enabled by different sorts of digital capacity. These positive affordances cannot be denied. Still, I propose that the shrinkage of the future through the expanding empire of the app and its broader ideological infrastructure in regard to failure, convenience, and obsolescence is the deeper and more troubling side of the new technologies. At the very least, we need a debate about why the future as a cultural fact is both expanding and shrinking in our times. And now I return just with a sentence on COVID and Corona to say that, of course, the actual epidemic disease related to COVID 19 has taken a huge human toll, not least in Italy, but also in the US, in the UK, here in Germany, in India, China, really all over the world. That is undeniable. But it is also true that in our efforts to control the disease, we are opening the door to a whole new level of surveillance, monitoring, uh, and compromise of privacy in numerous ways. So, again, with COVID, we have no choice but to use all the available technologies of which we have knowledge to fight this disease. But we have to recognize at the same time that there is a kind of shrinking going on, a shrinking of what sociality is about, what celebration is about, what distance is about, what travel is about. And in a way, what we're being asked to do in order to solve the problem of COVID is to restrict and limit our imaginations. And our imaginations are the engine of any future that we build. So anything that shrinks the imagination is worrisome. So COVID is worrisome in that way, as well as its threat to life and well-being. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lots of interesting and stimulating ideas. I will go back to the social life of things. And in the book, you examine goods, commodities in several ways, but you say a very important thing that uh, politics, policies can change our relationship with things. What should happen according to you after after the pandemic in our relationship with things, and what politics should do to change it or can do?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that can be done is to launch or engage in a critique of our patterns of consumption, especially for those of us who are in the middle or upper classes. For people who are below that line, it's difficult to say you must change this, you must change that, because you're so close to the edge. But for those who have what we call some income, which they can allocate freely, I think they need to do some thinking. And I would say that the thinking, whether it is about what you eat or where you travel or what leisure is about, pleasure is about, needs, how to put it, a little bit of introduction of a element of, I use the word asceticism, little bit of self-imposed reduction, because we have been invited to think of our needs and desires as limitless, the way that capitalism is limitless in what it thinks it can do, how it can grow. So, in a way, I'm saying we need to question the idea of growth as the key to happiness, both in the economy as well as in our private lives. We can certainly discover pleasures, for example, in reading, which is crucial to the book city, which are not expensive. I mean, of course, if you want to buy, if I want to buy a recent scholarly book, say from, I won't name them, some Dutch publisher, it could cost me 200 euros. It's too much. But generally, that's not true. And of course, as we all know, books can be borrowed, books can be bought by one person and read by 50 people. Libraries exist for that, public libraries, and so on. So, to me, that's a joy or a pleasure that can be done on a small scale while restricting, for example, very expensive pleasures, such as going to incredibly expensive theatrical shows or traveling to exotic places, etc. This, of course, those expensive things also have other costs on the environment, the planet, etc. So, in general, I would say a certain measure of asceticism or questioning of the virtues of more. Simply, I'll just call it more. Give me more, give us more. And doing that is a political matter. See, I think the mistake, historical mistake, has been to think that asceticism is a private thing. I choose it, you may not choose it. But to make it political is to make it collective, is to make it part of a public commitment to sustainability and to a certain form of asceticism, which in turn could have implications for redistribution. Because if I spend less, that money can go somewhere else. My taxes can go to other purposes, etc., etc. So it has some relationship also to justice and equality.
You called out my next question, and it's about a thing that is called a book. You've been studying societies with no books because they were before books, or perhaps because they want to be after books. What is the role of books after the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I honestly do believe that books will continue to be important as long as our species is here. Now, the trouble is, we know our species may not be here very long. So that forward history of the book may only be 50 years or 100 years, which is a sad thing. So let's say after Gutenberg, or roughly that period, it may be that we only have 50 or 100 years left after 500. Still, it's a very long innings. And of course, if we are very smart about climate and planetary survival, maybe we have a longer future ahead, although it's hard to know how that will happen in a timely way. But whatever the time frame, I think books will be part of our world as a species because I think places that are exposed to books, printing, reading, etc., never go away from that. There are a few extreme cases. For example, Cambodia under Pol Pot, where they really wanted to even remove books. Of course, they also wanted to remove money. So we know these are incredible dystopian ideas. But generally speaking, when people discover the pleasures of reading print, whether it's book, newspaper, magazine, they never go away from that. So take India, for example, country from which I come. There is a huge digital world. Everybody has mobile phones. They are doing this and that. There is TV, there's cinema. But books, magazines, newspapers, still extremely important, very crucial to the formation of public opinion, to pleasure, to keeping up with politics, to engaging critically with what's going on. That too for ordinary people, not just intellectuals. So I think the short way I'll put it is that books are deeply connected both with the democratic impulse. I am the same as you, we can read the same thing, but also with the capacity to resist fascism because you are refusing to be told how the world is by 5 people or 10 people. You are saying there is a bigger public which will inform me. I will not accept the view of 5 people in the mass media or 5 people in the state to define my. And today, I think there is a major struggle going on, which I'm sure you know more about than I, in which censorship and also imprisonment and murder of authors, journalists, and so on is going on because these anti democratic regimes, of which we have too many, understand that the book is a danger. Now, we already knew this from people like George Orwell, but we are learning, as it were, George Orwell 2.0. So, books are important both for democracy and for the battle against fascism. And I think they have become part of our humanity. That is, they are not a option. Do you want a book or you don't want it? It's become part, like language, it's become part of our being as a species. So I'm optimistic that so long as we last, books will last.
And I have another question with a kind of conflict of interest. You were speaking about the commodification of sociality that social media are working on at the moment. Uh, Book City is a live event. It's a non-digital form of sociality. What is the future of these forms of sociality, according to you?
Well, I think their future is slightly under threat. So that's my first concern is that this expansion of the world of apps and so on is emphasizing speed, convenience, and a kind of ersatz connectivity in a manner that can shrink the possibilities of, let's say, live sociality. And we see this when we see a group of people in a restaurant all looking at their iPhones. I mean, this is truly a pathological phenomenon, but it's very widespread. On the other hand, so I do worry about this, and that's why I say there is a kind of shrinkage we must watch, even if we like the convenience and the speed and so on. Uh, my anthropological side sees that, in fact, the live sociality, friendships conducted face to face, conversations, even if they use technology like our conversation, because of its spontaneity, its liveness, its unscripted quality, and the fact that it is also not based on utility. It's not you are buying something from me or I'm buying something from you or selling something to you. It's it's got no purpose in that sense, in the good sense. These things actually are, in my view, at the end of the day, so many, so widespread that they can never be fully sublated or dominated by the digital impulse, though the ambition to do that is great, just like the ambition of Amazon to control the production and distribution of everything. That ambition is there, but will they succeed? It's not so clear. They will try. But
Yeah,
likewise, with sociality, I think there are big efforts, but I think the diversity and deep coding in our beings of life sociality keeps me still very optimistic that these other forms will not
you
just
you
disappear.
talked about Amazon. What did Amazon change in the social lives of things? Did it change something, or things remain just the same but at a different scale?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there are many fascinating things about Amazon, not least is the virtually the ambition of Jeff Bezos to replace God by himself. So that outsized ambition, which characterizes 4 or 5 people today in the world, to just redefine human life, human nature, space, travel. It's all coming from Silicon Valley. Those guys. And Jeff Bezos is the commercial equivalent of that. He is not a Silicon Valley guy, but he is in many ways ahead of them, truly. So many things can be said about this and the dangers and worries that one has. But one way in relation to the social life of things is that he has opened on the side of the consumer the idea that anything can come to your door. This is a revolutionary thing. In other words, it's basically eliminating the idea of the shop, the store. And this is a basic pillar of modern life, is that you go shopping somewhere. No, now your home is like the shop, or the shop is like your home, which is a very dramatic development. That's from the customer side, which means that things, the social life of things, is in a way massively domesticated. And you and your things come very close together, and the man sending them to you is also coming close to you. It's like television. The other side is from the macroeconomic side. If you look at something like Amazon, what he is doing is actually redefining the nature of the relationship between production, storage, and distribution. So his aim at the end is that there will be no line between these things. So what will happen to Marx's critique in Capital of the factory floor and so on? Who knows? Because he doesn't only want to contain everything and then distribute it exclusively, but also slowly creep into making things. And if you watch Amazon, they are making almost everything. Soon Amazon will make ships, fighter planes, tanks, skyscrapers. There will be no limit. So what do we do with a world in which maybe not the only capitalist, but a super capitalist has closed the distance between production, inventory, and distribution? Wow. Then we will need another Marx, another critique altogether.
That's an ambitious task you put to yourself in some way. Uh, Another thing I wanted to ask you is that you talk, of course, of hopes, of the idea of a future, of aspirations, but these 2 years have been dominated by fear. What
Yeah.
happens in the balance between fear and hope, and the idea of a good life?
So I think that's a wonderful question, and I think we're all trying to struggle with it in some way. And the immediate thought is, of course, or the immediate impression one has is that there is a kind of change of the ratio, that the hope to fear ratio is changing and fear is dominating over hope in some kind of quantitative way. But I think, in fact, the relationship is qualitative, so that our fear, especially of disease, and that too disease which is connected to social interaction. So it's not just coming from the water. Like when I grew up in India, we had to worry about water, typhoid, dysentery, and so on, which are still very much there. They're not gone. But now we worry about my talking to you, my touching your hand, doing all the things which normally people do. So what happens, I think, is that hope itself gets somewhat modified by fear. So hope and aspiration, the cocktail changes because the mix is changing, and we're putting more and more, as it were, vermouth into the gin, so that the martini is actually changing. So hope itself is no longer as bold as it used to be, because we are teaching our imaginations to be disciplined, to be careful, to be confined. And if you think of that, that is against the spirit of hope and the imagination and so on. So the truth is, the kinship between these two things is growing in a worrisome way. And the approach that I would suggest to that is that we be aware of it, and not try to abolish the fear, because we know that fears that are pushed aside always come back in some other form, but simply be aware that this is a moment when we have to do this, but there is a part of ourselves we have to keep intact, so that when the COVID lifts, we will again still have the muscles to use our imagination, and the muscles have not become dead.
Okay, so this is a hope we have, a hope we must have. I thank very much Arjun Appadurai for his time and for his conversation. I recommend La Vita, Sociale, delle Cose, and also the last book you published with Cortina, which is called Fallimento, Failure. And some of the things you said in our conversation also come from that book. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon in Milano.
Mille grazie, mille grazie.
Grazie, grazie mille.